where we explore the unexamined and underexamined questions from the 20th century. But today we're going to be departing from our usual format, and instead we're going to have a special interview guest today. So I would like to introduce my dear friend Winston, who is a North American, a millennial, who's been living in the People's Republic of China for the better part of the last decade. And the plan today is to just bounce some questions off him and see what we can learn about the People's Republic of China.
Let me just ask you, Winston, how does it feel to be what do they call them, a Laowai?
A Laowai.
In China.
Well, I think it's good to be a non-black Laowai in China.
Right.
Because very selectively racist against non-whites. And so I really don't feel any covert racism from Chinese people towards myself or other Europeans or North Americans. So it's fine.
And to be clear, you speak the language, correct?
I do speak the language, yes.
Are you able to tell us, at least in the time you've spent there, what you have done? I mean, you work there, I assume, and can you describe like what type of industry it is?
I work dealing with connecting companies and products to be produced there and shifting production to China for certain areas of manufacturing.
So is it more like there are design companies in Western nations that want to manufacture in China and you connect the two?
Yeah, it's basically sourcing stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Why did you decide to move to China?
Well, I remember back in the day, it was just starting to become that China would take over the world. And I thought it would be fun to go there and to do stuff, learn the language, and work. So that's what I did.
Well, part of this set of questions is about China, obviously, but I have a sort of a different question because you've been away from North America for so long. What does the current Western world look like to you from China, with all the migration stuff happening in Europe and the election in the United States? How does all that look to you?
Well, it's really sad. It's really sad coming back to America and our terrible airports and infrastructure. I took the bullet train from one Chinese city to another a few weeks ago, last month in August, and it was just so fast and modern, and they didn't shake you down and try to see if you were a terrorist or not. You just got onto this bullet train in 5 minutes, and it took off and got you to this city that was nearby extremely fast. And coming back to America and just seeing how much it's changed since I was a kid, and it's just really terrible.
So it sounds like things have gotten worse in America from your perspective, and maybe better in China. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think they're just blowing past us in some respects. And every time I go back to America, people are just fatter and fatter and sicker and sicker.
Yeah.
And America looks like diversity society.
Do you think that China's rise has been more of a catch-up, or do you think this can continue?
Well, I mean, basically what they're copying plans for development that we had already created. When it's not like they're inventing anything new, which is really hard. Basically, if you want to build a building, you can just get blueprints and build it. But if you want to actually create something new, like the Manhattan Project or something that's never been done before, it takes huge amounts of resources and energy. And the Chinese have never built anything new before. So who knows if they actually can, but they're catching up extremely fast.
Right. I'm very bad at forecasting, but eventually I usually get things right. I get things wrong when it comes to when. Not if, though. But my theory is that someday China may look like Japan and that it starts slowing down a lot. Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, I think that's probably inevitable. And people have been saying that for a long bubble from 2009, 2008, I think is when it really began, and that's when the Chinese pumped so much cash into their system during the global financial crisis, and as a percentage of GDP, their stimulus was among ours, 33% of Chinese GDP at the time was how much stimulus they added to the economy. So it's been a long time. Now we're going on 7-8 years of people predicting that China is going to implode. And some people say that that argument for A, people were wrong, and it's not going to happen because the logic must have been false, or B, the problem must be getting worse and worse. So when things do implode, the consequences will be even more massive. And I think possibly it's the latter case, because if you look at corporate debt, for instance, as a percentage of GDP in China, rising and rising and rising past 9 years. And as I understand it, it's the highest in the world now. And nations, they're just not producing as much return on every additional dollar of debt as they were in the beginning, because say 20 years ago in the 1990s, if you borrowed money, you'd be putting it to work to import machinery from say Germany, and you'd set up a factory and you producing goods, and you could pay off the bet pretty quick, or the chin and have more. But now I'm not ready. Additional, getting very little economic benefit. And then you look at the huge amount of debt in the public sector. China, if you wanted to say federal China, the central government had, but the provinces have large amounts of debt, and they've been, putting this money into infrastructure projects that deliver less and less economic benefit. Say back in the 90s or even late 2000s, when you built a new highway, at least you could have tolls, and you were increasing increasing the amount of connectivity throughout the country. But now there are so many projects, pointless bridges, and airport terminals that no one uses that they don't create any real revenue, and they don't create a lot of economic activity in the economy. So that's a big problem. On the other side of the issue, China does have many advantages which really should make it grow very fast. Couldn't hear me.
No, it's good stuff. Let me ask you a question though,
Yeah.
about what you just said about kind of the empty airports and the big cities with no one in them, and the shopping mall. There was a funny news report I saw of this shopping mall that they had built, and there was like a koi pond that they put in the middle of like the middle of the mall where you're looking down from the other stores on the second floor and you can see the fish. And this mall never really got tenants, so they just abandoned it. And the fish, though, they still live there. And it actually like rained through the roof, and so now there's like a huge like ocean of like fish somewhere. So that's kind of what the media talks about. It catches your attention. But then you have people like Morgan Stanley's Stephen Roach, who is their head economist in the 90s, and then he became head of the Asia division in the 2000s in China specifically. And he says, China doesn't do things like we do in the West. They build before the demand is there. So they do make mistakes. But the first ghost city he ever saw was in Pudong, Shanghai, which now has 5 million people, and it went from something like probably 100,000. So his argument is that China is moving millions of people from the countryside, and they have to do this growth. I can counter-signal that as well, but that's his argument. Do you think that he has some accuracy in those statements?
Well, he might be right, but there would be a few problems with his reasoning. The first being that so many people have already moved from the countryside. It's difficult to say how many more people will immediately be able to fill these new projects. Even looking at statistics, we don't really know how many people are in the countryside or in the cities because so many workers are undocumented. So it seems like there are actually already a high amount of people living in the cities. Additionally, something like rice cultivation is extremely labor intensive. It's difficult to have large pieces of machinery to harvest and cultivate rice. So I would be wondering how ultimately, at least in the short term, how much of the population can be moved to the cities, especially since so many people have already gone there. Like many small villages are deserted now because so many people have left.
Yeah, and I've also heard that a lot of the construction actually goes to non-use by people who do own the flat, they call it, but they don't use it on purpose because that would decrease the value, the resale value in places like Shanghai. And I don't know what percentage of the market that represents, but I've actually heard in America that is happening on the West Coast, in places like San Francisco and Los Angeles. There's like empty buildings owned by Chinese nationals who just put their money into America because they're worried about a possible collapse in China. Again, forecasting is very difficult, but these are all just possibilities.
Well, one of the things that I think probably is fueling a possible housing bubble is the fact that China a system of property taxes to maintain school districts. So you could have many apartments empty with only the cost of the mortgage instead of any property taxes. And that's actually really huge. That's, a substantial amount of, the monthly cost would be, property taxes. So it makes a bubble much more possible.
What is the tax rate? Oh, sorry. I was just asking about taxes, which is kind of boring, so let's take your question instead.
Well, yeah, maybe we can decide to put this off for a few minutes, but I am fascinated by the whole idea of social capital and the idea of the role that, like, the ability to trust your neighbors and trust random people plays in, setting the ceiling on what a society can do. So there's this idea that the Protestant countries, especially the UK and Scandinavia and Germany, that they really benefited from having exceptional levels of social trust. So I wonder, Winston, if you could speak at all to the extent to which the Chinese are able to trust each other, and what they use to, if they're not able to trust each other, like how do they navigate their own situation?
Well, if you read all of the self-help books about doing business in China, they always talk about guanxi, about networking, and how important personal relationships are in China. And that's because in China it's very, very difficult to trust anyone who's not your blood relation or your personal friend. That's why so many Chinese companies have major shareholder being Mr. X, and then Mr. X's cousins, sons of brother, uncle. Everyone is working, even at a company that would be considered a Fortune 500 company in the United States. This is the way things work there. So I think it really is quite an impediment to coordinating economic activity.
I'm wondering, because specifically of the business that you're in, you hear so much about kind of Chinese industrial espionage, both from kind of products that have been manufactured in China, but also kind of targeted at overseas. For instance, by like interviewing Chinese nationals who come back into the country and just kind of gleaning whatever tidbits they can from them. I'm wondering if you're able to talk at all about, like, if that's just the impression or how much of a problem that is in reality.
Now, don't get me wrong. I have great respect for China. I have great respect for the Chinese people. But what they're doing to us on trade is wrong. So the Chinese have a very coordinated mission and policy to take intellectual property from the West and use it for industrial and military purposes. For instance, let's say you have a factory that's making pieces of machinery. Okay? So these days, large factories producing advanced machinery use software that can cost millions of dollars. And in the United States, Eastern Europe, countries pay for companies pay for the software, and it gets booked as cost on their income statements. But in China, they often will just steal this technology from the companies in the West. And this is a big problem, because if you take out the software cost of the factory, then the per unit cost of the things they're making drops significantly. So basically they can, by having a lower per unit cost, they can go way in below American and Western European companies, and that's even before currency manipulation. And they put American and Western European companies out of business, and then later they jack up the price. So, I have great respect for China and the Chinese people, but what they're doing is wrong.
So let me assume that you're in agreement with Donald Trump's assessment then of China.
I've been saying it for years. Basically, what Donald Trump has been saying, I've been telling people that we lose anywhere from 200 to 800 billion dollars per year to China. I actually think that this is a major contributing factor to their high GDP growth. Like, they should have run out of low-hanging fruit in the early 2000s, but there's really no reason why their economy should have been growing at 9 to 15%, and even more if you don't factor in inflation. So I think this is a major reason why their economy has been growing, even on a more micro level. In Chinese offices all across the country, no one pays for Windows XP. No one pays for any sort of software. It's just a huge ripoff.
Yeah, I've been saying it for years as well. Of course, no one listens, and that's the problem. When you have a lot of stupid people in a democracy, you get stupid decisions. So, do you have any advice? Because I can keep going, but this is basically, when we were going up against Japan in the 80s, their economy started looking a lot like China's, in that they became dependent on infrastructure and property development after they had to revalue their currency in 1985 at the Plaza Hotel. They had something called the Plaza Accords, where I think it was Germany, United States, and Japan all reset their exchange rates. And it gave the United States a exchange rate advantage, in that it was basically devaluing the dollar against the yen and the German mark. And so exports from the United States could have an easier time. And Americans, conversely, were not as inclined to pay the high prices from imports that the exchange rate will affect. And this is essentially what Donald Trump proposes. And so if you look at what happened to Japan after 1985, their economy had been growing a little bit like China's, and that it had been doing these double digits in the 60s, and I think they were high single digits, 70s, and then mid digits in the 80s. And then by the 90s, though, after Plaza Accords especially, they had become dependent on monetary policy, where they had cut their interest rates, and they had invested all this money into property. And there's this crazy statistic that said that the value of the land in the Imperial Palace in the middle of Tokyo, and it's not that big, it's maybe the size of like half of Central Park in New York, was equivalent to the property value of all of California. And this was at the peak of their property bubble. And so things are going crazy in Japan. And I don't think it's gotten that bad in China, but it might if they actually can't depend as much on exports as they have for so long now, for at least 25, 30 years. And so, if we get a leader in the United States that actually figures this out, we might have another boom like we had in the 90s. Because the way I read the 90s is, yes, we had information technology, but we also weren't competing against Japan like we were in the 80s. And so now, with China, I'm curious to see what happens. But the real question is, even if Trump gets in, how do you get these sort of ideas across people's heads? That's my question to you. Because, in China, people seem to get it, but in America, they don't.
Well, as I understand it, the president need is new trade deals with China and other countries. It's extremely difficult for American companies to do business in China. And say in America, someone rips off a Chinese product and starts making it without permission. The Chinese can easily sue that person and receive compensation. But if an American company goes to China to try to sue the Chinese, then they're not going to get anything. So what we need is for the WTO to actually be fair, we need real free trade among the United States and China, and we need real consequences for things that go on in China which damage American companies. And the Chinese always say that they're going to work on it, but they never do. So we need something substantial.
I'm wondering if we could switch gears a little bit. I had a question kind of about the internal dynamics of China. So you see often kind of these not necessarily protests, but kind of just mass movements of people. Like I think the expression is human search engine. When like some local official or someone caught on CCTV doing something bad kind of goes public, and everyone kind of tries to organize an internet lynch mob to chase them down. Is there kind of a different dynamic behind that sort of like social organization versus civil society in China? Can you just kind of speak a little bit on that general area?
Sure. Civil society does not work in China. In fact, it's the stated goal of the central government to have rule of law by 2025, I think it is. And that's actually they've been pushing it out. It used to be much earlier that they had planned to have rule of law, but it never really happens. So there's a lot of ambiguity in society about the consequences of people's actions and what people are entitled to, what actions they can take, and it makes things very complicated. So you often have very chaotic situations in order to resolve disputes that should be resolved in a much more simple manner.
Have you noticed any sort of, a while ago there was a large amount of discord around the Uyghur population, which are kind of the, I guess they're kind of closer to ethnically Turkish Muslim population north of Tibet. Are there kind of, can you talk a little bit about if you've noticed any of these sort of inter-ethnic conflicts between Han and non-Han within the Chinese population?
Well, I mean, it's the policy of the central government to set up colonies in the Uyghur areas in the West and other so-called autonomous regions. So I don't think on the level of everyday societies there's much tension. But as a general policy for long-term aims, I think that there is a plan in place.
Is there simultaneously, so they seem to have a policy of like almost population replacement in some of these other areas. Is there any kind of corresponding effort like you might see in other countries to kind of promote integration of the local elite, or is it pretty much just straight up Han supremacy?
Well, I think the Han represent 92% of the population. And so I don't think that there's much integration integration as a value. So I don't think they're thinking too much about it. I think it's more about population placement.
Yeah, and I know the Han Chinese are actually incentivized to breed with the ethnic minorities because their children retain, the being an ethnic minority despite being, half Han. So I think that I actually know personally of cases, some time I spent in China, where so-called people who claim to be, some minority group are actually, 2/3 Han or 3/4 Han.
Well, actually, from what I understand, I think you get special privileges and you get into school easier if you're a minority, if you're not Han. So I don't think that necessarily incentivizes Hans marrying. I think it just, well, I guess it could. Yeah, I guess I'd agree with that.
Is the issue of Taiwan taken at all kind of seriously on a ongoing basis? It seems like there's just kind of this policy of, as long as they don't explicitly do something silly, then they'll just kind of continue trading, and China will just continue trying to exert kind of soft power or regional hegemony over there. But there's no actual kind of desire to force the issue as far as reunification. Is that an accurate impression?
Well, there was a PLA, People's Liberation Army study done that said it was in 2010, the Chinese military finally had the ability to win a war against Taiwan. So it's actually only been very recently that the PLA itself has assessed the situation and said that military victory would even be possible. Sorry, go on.
Does that include America in the equation? So if they're going to go up against Taiwan,
just Taiwan.
Just now they feel like they're confident they can take Taiwan. Give me a break.
Sorry, back in 2010, but
even then still.
Island invasions are no picnic.
Yeah,
Right.
Taiwan has a great navy and a great air force and well-trained troops.
yeah, I mean, you just have a few Aegis cruisers, some missiles. It would be difficult to storm the island.
Yeah.
So, at this point, as I understand it, the Chinese military would certainly take action if there was a declaration of independence on Taiwan. And Deng Xiaoping said that the Taiwan problem had to be settled by 2015, and they haven't done anything yet. But it's still an ancillary sort of goal of the government to settle the question, and they're still innovating and creating new weapons, and many of their development is aimed at Taiwan.
What does the average man on the street in China feel about Taiwan? Do they feel like it's part of China and they're not only justified, but they're willing to actually go to war? Or do they have some sort of wisdom that Americans never seem to figure out until we actually go over there, get our nose bloodied, and then find out, wow, that wasn't so fun? So I'm wondering, what is the will to do something like taking Taiwan over, like in China?
The beginning of your question, do they want to? Will they if they could? Yes and yes. Even average citizens really want to go to war with Taiwan and Japan, Philippines. I remember one girl telling me that we
why I said it the way I asked it before, because I feel like this is how America was before Iraq happened and that disaster unfolded. And I don't think China actually understands what they're saying. They just don't have the generation that's saying these things. They have no experience with it. I mean, the last war they fought was where? In India or Vietnam? I mean, Korea, actually, the United States and China fought, but that was in the 50s. And so it's been a long time for them.
Yeah, absolutely. They have no idea what the consequences would be.
Yeah.
A war between the United States, China, and Japan would be apocalyptic. Pretty much any way it went down. Aside from massive destruction of cities, probably the entire country of Japan would be starved from submarine warfare, destroying transports going there. All the global supply chains would be cut off. It would be complete chaos. Even if the war was brief, which it probably wouldn't be, we would have a massive worldwide depression because companies would just simply stop being able to produce products. And people would lose jobs, income for the government through taxes. It would just be complete chaos.
What do you think the likelihood of a conflict between the superpowers, as it were, is? And that may even include Russia.
Well, I guess the way things are going, you could calculate odds against time. For instance, what are the chances of a conflict between Japan and China this year? I don't know, 10%? Just recently, the Chinese sent fighters into the East China Sea, into disputed airspace, I guess we could call it. And the Japanese scrambled their fighters, and the Chinese have a nice way of locking on to the Japanese planes and trying to get them to fire back. And this has happened hundreds of times this year.
That's bad. That's really bad. Yeah, they're trying to provoke something.
Yeah. So maybe this year, the 10%, but if things keep up like this, in 3 years' time, maybe the chances are 40%. In 10 years' time, it could be like 90%.
Now, why do you think China does that?
Well, there's a great book about China called Fragile Superpower. And whenever you talk to Americans about this book, they'll say, because Fragile Superpower is about China, and they'll say, what? China? Fragile? And whenever you talk to Chinese people about this book, they say, what? China? Superpower? So, China is a superpower, but it's very fragile politically. So, most foreign policy is driven by Chinese internal politics. And at this time, Chinese internal politics are extremely chaotic, and an aggressive foreign policy is meant to boost the power of the party at home in the eyes of the people by misdirection.
Speaking of internal politics, I've heard a fair amount about the kind of anti-corruption campaign, I guess is how it's described of their current government, but it sort of starts to look like more of a power grab dynamic when they're focusing their anti-corruption efforts on all of their kind of internal political opponents. Have you noticed, or could you talk kind of a little bit about sort of their internal power dynamics?
Well, if you talk to the person on the street there, they're all just very excited about the anti-corruption campaign. But looking at Chinese recent history, it's pretty clear that every time a new faction takes power, they have a purge of the other party and claim that it's a anti-corruption campaign. So it's pretty textbook stuff in China. And Xi Jinping, God bless him, he's a strong executive. He's the decider. He's making decisions. Fortunately, his top economic advisor, not even advisor, the premier of China, Lu Keqiang, he is supposed to be in charge of the economy because China is a well-oiled machine. It's a command and control economy, but they have it down to a science. It's probably not as good as a free market, but it's a machine that they know how to run. But unfortunately, Li Keqiang was on the other side of the party. He was in an opposing party. And basically, Xi Jinping has stripped him of his power. And there's no one running the economy right now. It's just the machine has no one running it because Xi Jinping, God bless him, he's a good politician. He knows how to get things done, but he doesn't know anything about the economy. And I think that this might actually be the best kept secret about what's going on with the Chinese economy. No one's in control right now because it's just total political chaos. So that's probably what's happening.
I'm very curious if you could talk more about how that works, because the concept of central planning is a little bit alien to Western quote-unquote democracies, of course, in that the government does not run the economy. Now, in communism, the government is the economy. But China, as far as I have been taught by my neoliberal professors, has been liberalizing for the past 30 years. So what is it and how does it work? I mean, in practice, like, does the Communist Politburo, you can give me the right name for that, but did they sit down and say, okay, we need to have X units of coal production this year, and we need to have this many units of steel, and this many people working over here? Like, how detailed do they get, and what sectors of the economy are they actually in charge of? Because there is a private sector, but how does that separate? How does this break down?
Well, it might be okay to say that it was much easier to plan the economy many decades ago, say in the 90s or the 2000s, when there was more low-hanging fruit. A lot of what they used to do with their 5-year plans was actually not super bad. It was, what they were doing was they were planning how they were going to create infrastructure to support a modern economy, to get goods from factories to ports and create new transportation systems. And central planning is good for that. The Chinese, if you look at the Politburo, everyone is an engineer. They went to China's top engineering schools. So they're really good at building stuff and planning to build stuff, which was great. If you look at countries, I should say, so many people will say China is going to lose out to India or Indonesia or Vietnam from manufacturing low-cost products. But the problem with building factories in Vietnam and Indonesia and these countries is that it's extremely difficult to get your products to a port. They don't have functioning roads. They don't have ports that can haul large containers into ships. So China was actually very prescient in how they built up their infrastructure ahead of demand. In that respect, Stephen Roach was quite right. The Chinese did a very good job. But now that most of the low-hanging fruit is gone, a lot of their 5-year plans focus on what they guess to be emerging technologies or important sectors. For instance, the past year, it's been their policy to encourage startups. So they've pumped hundreds of billions of dollars into startups all across China. And I can't remember the specifics of the statistics, but the amount of money they're putting into these companies is many, many, many times more than Silicon Valley startups are being funded at. If you look at the aggregate amount of venture capital in Silicon Valley, the Chinese are pumping money in orders of magnitude higher than Silicon Valley is, and that in itself is extremely wasteful. And it's wasteful because you can't plan it very well. You don't know which companies are going to be successful, so you just try to spend lots of money. Whereas planning infrastructure is relatively simple. You can, guess relatively well at what future economic activity is going to be, and you build something that will be able to facilitate that. So I think central planning is running into some problems now. In terms of parts of the economy like coal and steel, China still has large steel plants that are run by the state. What they do is they make them into corporations with the state controlling a majority stake. They list them on the stock exchange, and they create some bit of competition between them and global and domestic rivals. They still, even though they're expected to turn a profit, what ends up happening is these companies take out huge amounts of debt, and they get special privileges, and they're not really quite ever competing in a fair way. And this is actually a reason why the corporate debt is so high, is because the state-run enterprises have incredible connections with the government, and therefore the banks, which are also state-run corporations, or majority-held state corporations. So they can take out huge loans to produce more growth, give themselves dividends, bonuses, etc.
So who is paying for all this waste? You described the startups, and I'm assuming these big state-run steel mills. I read the statistic that China produces over half the world's steel, not just, like of Asia, but like the entire planet. And the entire economy of like Australia is like geared to this country. If China did not inhale so much iron ore every year, Australia would have a huge depression. So if that doesn't really seem like it's probably needed. And so if that's a big wasteful sector, and these startups are kind of wasteful, and you have these ghost cities, yet China is still growing, where's the sort of like source of capital, the wealth that's driving this deficit internally? Because externally they have a big surplus, right? So where is that competitiveness coming from in the economy, would you say?
Well, the Chinese debt started from a very low base. the global financial crisis that so much of the growth began to be created by debt. If you look at debt as a percentage of GDP, especially corporate debt of GDP, it is continuing to rise at a very fast pace. So the question is, once it gets to some level where massive defaults start to happen, is there going to be a large crisis, or is there going to be a slow deflation? So that's the question.
Well, if I may try to combine your answer with my question, it sounds like the source of savings is Chinese individuals. Like, they're basically, I've heard a statistic also that like Chinese save like crazy. So the money, which then gets deposited into these big banks, is then sent right back out to work. And those savings accounts, which I've heard maybe are running at like 30% of a person's income every year, is added to the savings account. Maybe those things aren't so reliable if people went in and actually asked for their money back. It sounds like the individual citizen, is basically paying for all this stuff. So it's just hard work. I don't know if there's any other way to put it. But that's more my sort of analysis on it. And people forgoing consumption, essentially. Okay, so given that you've been in China for 5 years and you're from North America, where do you honestly see yourself in the next 5 years? Do you want to be in Asia? Do you want to be in Europe? Africa? You tell us. Where do you want to be? And why?
Well, I'd like to see Trump become president, rewrite these trade deals, make it a much more inviting place to live, better trade deals. We could forcibly make them play fair, where their companies can make profits in the United States and buy major movie houses. And we can also partake in the Chinese economy.
What is missing in America that you think Donald Trump can bring?
Well, we need competence. It's really all about competence. The great strength that China has is that they have fast decision-making ability, and they can coordinate their policies very easily. In the United States, it's not so much a problem of having a division between, say, the executive and congressional branches of the government, but that we have so many special interests also messing up American policy. So, hopefully, Trump can redirect American foreign and economic policy in a more coherent way by stripping out so much influence from special interests. And when he said that he could get Carl Icahn to go rewrite the trade deals with China, I thought that's just a fabulous idea. That's exactly what we need. We need someone who's just as smart as the Chinese to go and negotiate against them. Because when you negotiate a contract in the West, you often negotiate based on expectations that a party will or will try to live up to their obligations. But with dealing with the Chinese, you need to think several moves ahead to create incentives and disincentives for the other side breaking their word. And I think someone like Carl Icahn would be fabulous at that, because he doesn't trust anyone.
Right.
So he would create deals where he knows that the other side, even if they don't do what they say they will do, the deal is smart enough that they will be compelled to do so.
I think you're completely right. My interactions with China have been, people will cheat you if they can. and it doesn't matter what they say because they don't have a honor system like we're used to. And so if you, like you said, you have an incentive for them to keep their word, that's a good deal. That's well